When my son, Ethan, was about 3 or 4 years old, he began crying at night, a lot. At the time, I brushed it off as nightmares or typical childhood fears. I was a single mother, overwhelmed and exhausted, and there were nights when I let his cries drift into the background as I struggled to rest. I'd hear his muffled sobs through the thin walls, my heart heavy with guilt but my body too weary to move. Now, nearly a decade later, Ethan has shared something that has shaken me to my core. It was a quiet evening when he finally brought it up, his voice hesitant but laced with a strange mixture of fear and relief. "Mom," he said, staring at the floor, "do you remember when I used to cry a lot at night in the old house?" I nodded, my stomach tightening. "Of course. You'd wake up scared, and sometimes you'd say you saw shadows or something." He shook his head slowly. "It wasn't shadows. It was, them." A chill ran down my spine. Them. Ethan's eyes met mine, his expression dark and serious. "They were these figures. I don't know what they were, but there were always a lot of them. 6, maybe 10. They'd stand around my bed, glowing blue, like neon lights, but just the outlines. They were so tall and skinny, like they weren't even human." My breath caught in my throat. "What did they do?" "They danced," he said, his voice trembling. "Not like happy dancing, but slow and weird. It was like they were mocking me. They'd get really close to me, almost touching my bed, and no matter how much I cried, they wouldn't leave. Sometimes they'd turn and just walk into my closet, like it was some kind of door." I felt a cold sweat on my neck. "Why didn't you tell me?" Ethan shrugged, his face pale. "I tried, but you said it was just my imagination. After a while, I stopped telling you. They hated it when I cried, though. They'd get closer, almost angry. It felt like they wanted me to be quiet, like they were trying to control me." I sat there, stunned, my mind racing back to those nights when his cries would echo through the house. The guilt hit me like a tidal wave. All those times I'd dismissed his fears, chalking them up to the overactive imagination of a toddler, I had no idea he was enduring this. And worse, I had left him alone to face it. "Did it ever stop?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded. "It stopped when we moved. I never saw them again after we left that house." The house. That creaky, old place with its dim hallways and perpetually cold rooms. It had always felt off, though I'd never paid much attention to it. Now, Ethan's words were filling in gaps I hadn't realized existed. I remembered feeling uneasy there, as if something unseen was always watching. And Ethan wasn't the only one who cried at night. There had been times when I'd woken up with an inexplicable sense of dread, my heart pounding for no reason. I can't help but wonder now, was there something in that house? Something dark, something malevolent. Ethan's description of the glowing figures is eerily similar to things I've heard about in passing, stories of strange beings that move in unnatural ways and seem to thrive on fear. But why had they targeted him? And what did they want? The thought that my son endured years of terror while I turned a blind eye fills me with a deep, gnawing regret. I've started looking into other accounts of similar experiences, trying to piece together what might have happened in that house. For Ethan's sake, and for my own, I need answers. Whatever those beings were, they left a scar on him that may never fully heal. And they left me with the haunting realization that sometimes, the things we dismiss as imagination might be all too real. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how much I'd overlooked back then. It wasn't just Ethan's cries or the occasional shiver of unease. There were other signs, subtle, almost forgettable at the time, but now glaringly obvious in hindsight. The way the closet door in his room never seemed to stay shut no matter how many times I closed it. The faint, almost imperceptible hum that would emanate from his room at night, like a low electrical buzz. And the strange marks I'd sometimes find on his bedroom floor, faint, glowing smudges that I'd chalked up to some kind of toy he'd been playing with. But the toys never glowed. And Ethan never had anything that could explain those marks. I started searching for answers. Late at night, after Ethan had gone to bed, would sit in the dark with my laptop, scouring forums and obscure websites for anything that matched his description of the figures. Most of what I found was vague, urban legends, ghost stories, people sharing their nightmares. But one night, I stumbled upon a thread buried deep in a paranormal discussion board. The title caught my eye immediately, Blue Neon Figures by the Bedside. My heart raced as I clicked on it. The user described an experience that mirrored Ethan's almost exactly, tall, thin figures outlined in glowing blue light, appearing at night, moving in unnatural ways. They too had seemed to emerge from the closet, and they had reacted aggressively to fear and noise. The post was years old, and the user hadn't replied to any of the comments. But the similarities were too striking to ignore. I kept reading, diving deeper into the thread. Others had chimed in with their own encounters. Some claimed the figures were entities from another dimension, slipping through thin spots in reality. Others believed they were manifestations of trauma or fear, given form by the human mind. One comment stood out, though. It was from someone who claimed to be a researcher in interdimensional phenomena. According to them, these figures were called the Silent Ones. They thrived on fear, using it to anchor themselves to our world. The more terrified their target became, the stronger their hold. Crying or screaming only fed them, which was why they would become more aggressive in response. The researcher warned that the only way to weaken their influence was to confront them with calmness and defiance, an impossible task for a terrified child. I felt a surge of rage and helplessness. How could Ethan have faced something like that alone? How had I let it happen right under my nose? The idea of these silent ones preying on my son made my skin crawl, but it also made me determined to protect him now, even if it was too late to undo the damage. The next day, I brought it up with Ethan. I didn't want to scare him, but I needed to know more. Ethan, I began hesitantly, do you remember if they ever tried to talk to you? Or did they just dance and watch you? He looked up from his cereal, his brow furrowing in thought. They didn't talk, he said slowly, but I could kind of hear them. Like, not with my ears, but in my head. A chill ran through me. What did they say? It wasn't words, exactly, he explained. It was more like feelings. Like they wanted me to be quiet and stop crying. But sometimes it felt like they were laughing at me. Not out loud, but in my head. The idea of these beings invading his mind made my stomach churn. Did they ever touch you? He shook his head quickly. No. They got really close, but they never touched me. I don't think they could. I wasn't sure if that was a relief or not. If they couldn't touch him, it meant there were limits to their power. But the fact that they could project thoughts and emotions into his mind was horrifying enough. I decided to dig deeper into the history of the house. It had been an old place, built in the 1920s, with a long string of previous owners. I went to the local library and searched through old records, newspapers, and archives. What I found was unsettling. The house had a history of strange incidents. One family had moved out suddenly, leaving most of their belongings behind. Another had reported seeing shadows in the corners of their eyes and hearing whispers at night. And then there was the tragedy: a boy, around Ethan's age, who had died in the house in the 1970s under mysterious circumstances. The cause of death was listed as unknown, but neighbors at the time had whispered about strange lights coming from the house on the night he died. I felt a knot tighten in my chest. Was this boy another victim of the Silent Ones? Had they been haunting that house for decades, feeding on the fear of its inhabitants? And more importantly, had we escaped them when we moved, or were they still with us in some way, lingering in the shadows? As I pieced together the fragments of this dark puzzle, I realized that this wasn't just about understanding what had happened to Ethan. It was about ensuring it never happened again, to him, to me, or to anyone else who might ever live in that house. But the more I learned, the more I felt like I was staring into an abyss that could swallow me whole. The next few weeks were a blur of research and restless nights. I felt like I was racing against something unseen, a threat that might still be lurking in the periphery of our lives. Despite Ethan's assurance that he hadn't seen the figures since we moved, I couldn't shake the fear that they hadn't truly gone, that they were biding their time. I sought out help from anyone who might have answers. Paranormal investigators, spiritual advisors, even a psychologist who specialized in childhood trauma. Each had their own theory. The investigators believed that the Silent Ones were bound to the house and could not follow us. The spiritual advisor suggested a cleansing ritual for our new home, just to be safe. The psychologist, however, focused on Ethan's emotional well-being, urging me not to dwell too much on the past or let my fears transfer to him. But it was a conversation with an elderly librarian that gave me the most unsettling piece of information. She had been working at the library for decades and remembered hearing stories about our old house. "There's always been something strange about that place," she said, her voice low. "People talked about lights, sounds, and other things. Some thought it was cursed. Others believed it was a gateway." "A gateway?" I echoed, my throat tightening. "To another world, or another plane of existence. Who knows," she said with a shrug. "But whatever it is, it's not natural. And it's not safe." Her words lingered in my mind long after I left the library. If the house was a gateway, then the Silent Ones weren't just spirits or figments of imagination. They were something else entirely, something far more dangerous. Determined to close this chapter of our lives for good, I decided to return to the house one last time. It had been vacant for years, its windows boarded up and its yard overgrown with weeds. I brought with me a small bag of items: salt, candles, sage, and a notebook filled with protective chants I'd found online. I didn't know if any of it would work, but I had to try. Standing on the crumbling porch, I felt a wave of nausea. The air around the house was heavy, almost suffocating. As I stepped inside, the memories came flooding back. The creak of the floorboards, the faint smell of damp wood, the oppressive silence. It was as if the house itself was watching me. I made my way to Ethan's old bedroom, the epicenter of his torment. The closet door was ajar, just as it had always been, and the faint hum he described was still there, vibrating in the stillness. I lit the candles and began the ritual, sprinkling salt around the room and burning the sage. My voice trembled as I recited the chants, but I forced myself to continue. Halfway through, the temperature in the room plummeted. The candles flickered wildly, and the hum grew louder, almost deafening. I felt a presence behind me, and every instinct screamed at me to run. But I stood my ground, clutching the notebook like a shield. "You don't belong here," I said, my voice shaking but firm. "This house is closed to you. Leave and never return." For a moment, the room was silent. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw them. Tall, thin figures outlined in blue neon, just as Ethan had described. They didn't move, didn't dance. They simply stood there, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I repeated the chant, louder this time. "Leave this place. You have no power here." The figures began to fade, their outlines flickering like dying light bulbs. The hum grew quieter, and the air around me seemed to lighten. Finally, they were gone. I finished the ritual and left the house without looking back. As I drove away, I felt a strange mixture of relief and unease. Had I truly banished them, or had they simply retreated, waiting for another opportunity? Back at home, I hugged Ethan tightly and promised myself that I would never let him face anything like that again. We've since moved on, building a life filled with light and laughter, but the memory of the silent ones lingers. They are a reminder of the darkness that can exist just beyond the veil of our understanding, and of the resilience it takes to face it. Ethan and I haven't talked about the figures since, but sometimes, late at night, I'll catch him staring at his closet door, as if expecting it to open. When he sees me watching, he smiles and says he's fine. And maybe he is. But I can't help but wonder if the silent ones ever truly left, or if they're still out there, waiting for their next dance.